SQL databases in Fabric are in public preview. You've probably been wondering, what's the difference between Azure SQL Database and SQL Database in Fabric, and why should I use one versus the other? Learn all about it this week on Data Expose MVP Edition. Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this episode of Data Exposed. Today, I'm joined by Ben, an MVP in the community. And Ben, for folks who might not know you, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, what I do, that's a very philosophical question, but I'll try. I'm Ben. As you said, I'm based out of Nuremberg, Germany. I've been working in the SQL world since SQL Server 6.5, been an MVP for a couple of years. Lover of all things SQL and data, I should say. Whenever someone asks me for my professional title, I give them data passionist, until someone recently called me out and was like, what does that even mean? I was like, I don't really know, but I love data. I guess that's what it means. But still, I'm very heavy in the traditional SQL world. We still do a lot of on-prem stuff. Sorry. So a lot of SQL Server stuff. So one of the tools or features that recently came up was very exciting for me because apparently we now have SQL databases in Fabric. So I kind of get best of both worlds, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great topic for today. And I think today we're going to talk, and we chatted a while back about can we talk about this? And I think we absolutely should be talking about this. And this topic is kind of like SQL databases in Fabric, which folks have probably been hearing about. We'll talk a little bit about is in public preview, and how's it different from Azure SQL or Azure SQL Database. So I think it's a great topic. I'm really looking forward to getting an MVP's perspective out into the world. So Ben, why don't you tell us, what do you think?
Sure. So many people probably have seen this or a very similar slide before. I have no idea how much wider the slide can get, because at some point there was only SQL Server and then all these things kept getting updated. And I think getting SQL into Fabric is kind of a next logical step. And same thing basically applies to that slide that everybody who is familiar with Fabric probably has seen, where we now have that databases icon there. We have all these different needs, and whenever we talk about something is end-to-end, one part was always kind of missing, and I think this is kind of bridging that gap. So now we have the possibility of getting SQL databases, as the name suggests, in Fabric. And what was very confusing to me in the beginning, we had long chats about this, and many people asked me about tons of discussions going on in the community with customers. Okay, so we now have that new icon, but because when we had something like SQL Linux, it was kind of clear on how that was different. It was kind of in the name. It was running on a different operating system, but kind of doing the same engine stuff. Whereas now, is this the same as Azure SQL? Is it something entirely different, just sharing a name? So when we get to the question, how is it different? And your answer may be different than mine, but to me it is just less switches, toggles, and knobs. That's kind of the headline I came up with, because it comes with tons of things out of the box that I don't have to care about, but I also cannot care about. So when we look at SQL databases in Fabric, at first sight, it is a regular Azure SQL DB. So it is using those MDF files. So one of the questions we've had in the beginning, and that I was also wondering, okay, everything in Fabric is lake-centric. Everything in Fabric is in one lake. Does that mean that all my data of that Azure SQL DB or Fabric SQL DB will be in one lake? And the answer is yes and no. Because by default, all my data in that Fabric SQL DB will get mirrored into one lake. So yes, it is in one lake, but the original data, the native data, sits in an MDF as it would in any other Azure SQL DB. We're still using Azure Storage and all that, but if I would be deploying, and we're going to see that in a second, a demo, if I was about to deploy a SQL DB in Azure, it would ask me tons of questions. What kind of storage do you want? What's your resource group? What's your firewall rules? What's this and what's this and what's this and what's this? All these things I don't have to care about, because it is making things much more simple to me. Everything comes out of the box. It is simpler. And that's also how it makes things different, because I can scale it. It does auto scaling. I can change the way it behaves with terms of high availability, security, firewall, indexing, well, indexing kind of, because I could still provide my own indexes, but it does all these things for me. I don't care about updates. I don't care about backups, et cetera, et cetera. But also I can control those because they're all under the hood. And that is where I see the very big difference. So someone is like, I really need to change this very, very specific setting under the hood to match exactly this and this specification. They would probably not be too happy with doing that in Fabric SQL DB. And there will be very good use cases of still doing exactly that. Whereas in many other cases, people would stick to the defaults in many cases anyway, where I'm like, well, if I don't need to care about all these settings, why do I need to expose them to whoever deploys that SQL DB? And
Yeah,
that is
absolutely.
kind of
I
where
think
I see the big difference.
it makes a ton of sense. And I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on, when you pitch this and when you explain it to people, does this make sense to them afterwards? And then, I think you said you have some things you can show us the comparison as well. I think that would be great.
To your question, yes, it does make sense to them afterwards, in the term that there's people that are like, oh, maybe this is just not for this use case. And they're exactly right about that. So I'm kind of making the assumption here, Azure SQL isn't going anywhere because, well, it's a huge product and it's pitching to a couple of use cases that Fabric SQL does not. And
Absolutely.
then you will have tons of things that you could do with either. And honestly, the same thing is true within Fabric. There's so many things where, like, if you're using a lakehouse for this, if you're using a warehouse for this, or now if you're using a SQL database for it, you would get the exact same result, maybe with a slightly different cost, because one might consume a little more vCores or a little more capacity units, and one might make you use a notebook, whereas the other might allow you to use a SQL endpoint. But on a high level overview, there's so many things where the when to choose what honestly comes with an it doesn't really matter answer. But there's also tons of use cases where it does matter. And one of those things for SQL DB in Fabric is one of the very low hanging fruits to me, something like from the very beginning. We do lots of ETL stuff, even though ETL is kind of going away here, but it's never going away entirely. I always try to automate that, back with integration services, then with Data Factory, et cetera. To automate ETL or to automate pipelines and all that, you will need a metadata store. And that will always sit very well in a SQL DB. You could put it in a warehouse, and that's what we've been doing for a while now, just because it was the best choice we've had. It sits better in a SQL DB. But anything that is like real OLTP, I'm building an application that needs a transactional database behind it, where you could jump through some hoops and make that work within either a data warehouse, where it doesn't really belong, or in an external database, and then think about how do I integrate that, where again, I could now deploy my Azure SQL DB standalone and then set up my mirroring, which I could do today, and my data would still end up in one lake, but it would be an extra component for me to think about. It would be an extra process. It would be an extra, not pipeline, but still that mirroring process needs to be monitored, et cetera, et cetera. So it just makes things simpler and easier at the cost of giving up a little bit of control.
Awesome. No, that makes sense. I love it. Yeah, let's take a look.
Perfect. So let me jump right in here. I will actually jump in here. Okay. So I'm in Fabric. I'm in my workspace. And if I wanted to deploy a new SQL DB in here, all I do is I say new item as I would for any other artifact in Fabric. And I say I want to deploy a database. Where it says SQL Database Preview. As you've pointed out, it is currently in public preview. So if you do not see that in your Fabric tenant, you may have to enable it. And all it's going to ask me for is a name. As with, again, pretty much every other Fabric artifact. So I'm just going to call that test DB and say create. And while that runs, I actually got to be quick because this is going to finish so fast. If I go back to the Azure portal and hit create here to create a regular Azure SQL DB. So I'm going to search for Azure SQL. Click on here, say create. And you can already see on that screen, first of all, I have to make that choice, but SQL Databases is the obvious equivalent here. We have all these different tabs up here: networking, security, additional settings. We have the basics where we need subscription, resource group, database name, my server, what kind of server am I using? Am I even using a server? Am I using hyperscale? All these questions that I need to think about. Whereas in the Fabric side of the house, if we close this, it's already done using all these defaults. I could now go ahead and populate some sample data in there, which is going to take like a good 2 minutes. And I'm going to get AdventureWorks LT in there, which is super useful just to get started with it. But just to save these 2 minutes, I already deployed another database for us. Got to switch my workspace here. So I have a very nice database prepared called Bob Loves the Titans. Hey, Bob. So what you will see is by default, it deployed me a semantic model and also a SQL Analytics endpoint. Another thing that is very confusing to people in the beginning, to be quite honest, because now I have my SQL database that still comes with 2 different SQL endpoints. Mm-hmm. It is simply following that logic that everything in Fabric is kind of following. So you have that regular SQL endpoint, which is the endpoint that you would connect to, for example, using SSMS or ADS or whatever tool you would be using, which you can create tables through, you can update data through. It's a SQL DB. Then you have the analytics endpoint that basically does the same thing as the analytics endpoint in the other experiences. So since I've already pre-deployed some data in here, I see my schemas, I have my tables. I can click on it here and I will get a preview of my data. But I could also connect to that same database here in SSMS and do everything I'm used to.
Nice.
So if I'm a SQL person, SSMS or whatever tool you're using, just connect to the endpoint. It's going to give me the server name and the database name. I can copy and paste those, connect to it. It is all Entra ID. So all I need is an Entra account because everything security-wise in Fabric sits on Entra. So no firewall rules. I could still use something like conditional access to make sure you only get access from specific countries, etc. So you get to the same thing like a firewall rule, but you have to kind of rethink the methodologies in some parts. So, and since all that stuff is already built in, I can now say, okay, I care about the performance of my database, and I'm getting a performance summary right here, which is going to give me an idea of how many vCores I've recently been using, what the development over that was. I even get a detailed performance dashboard showing me, okay, what's my current CPU consumption, my user connections, et cetera, who is connected through which tool, all of that, all built in right here. But of course, I could also still use all the monitoring solutions that I'm used to for my SQL DB. I can go here to my replication monitor, where it will give me all of my tables. And all of these tables, like I said, will automatically be replicated into OneLake. So if I go to my OneLake Explorer and just fire that up real quick, go to my workspace. I got my Bob Loves the Titans database in there, got all my tables. And I could go ahead and just open that Parquet file using any Parquet viewer just to see what's in there. But since this is now in OneLake, I can use that data and, for example, use that as a shortcut and build it into my lakehouse for my analytical purposes, as I would with any data that just sits in Parquet. So I have my OLTP data automatically mirrored into OneLake, and I can fulfill all my analytical needs as well. And the other thing that I find very, very appealing about this is, to me as a SQL person, I could be like, well, it makes a couple of things easier, but those things were not necessarily hard for me to achieve using Azure SQL DB. But there's also tons of, and especially in the dev world, tons of people that are not native SQL developers. So another very cool thing here is the GraphQL integration, because it's going to call that Bob API. I can create a new Graph API here. And in that Graph API, all I need to do is decide which data I want to expose. So I'm going to click on that single table. I could take all my tables, could take a subset of them. And that data will now be exposed through the Graph API. So rather than writing SQL code, I can now go ahead and use Graph. and write a query here with full IntelliSense or use Copilot to do exactly that. It would even generate me the code to do that in either Python or Node.js to access that exact endpoint and consume that data from that SQL DB in my application without knowing a little bit of SQL. And that, I mean, I could keep talking about that for the next 7 hours, 7 days potentially. But if you ask me what the difference is between Azure SQL DB and SQL databases in Fabric, I think it is that simplicity, giving up a little bit of control. And I can totally see tons of use cases where I would not want to do that. And at the same time, I see tons of use cases where that is perfect. And since all of that is in Fabric, it's just part of my capacity unit model as well. So there's nothing wrong with just deploying a small SQL DB in there and, for example, just using it for my metadata repository rather than bringing that in from anything external.
Awesome. I love it. Ben, you brought a very honest voice of customer, voice of people you've talked to, voice of MVP. And honestly, I probably couldn't have said it better myself. So I'm super excited to have had you on the show. I hope this was useful for users. I think it was. I think even myself, I learned a couple things. So Ben, thanks so much for coming on the show. For folks who watch this episode, go ahead, give it a like, leave us a comment, and let us know what you think the biggest difference is or what you want to use SQL Database in Fabric for. And we'll put some links in the description for you to learn more. And we hope to see you next time on Data Exposed.